At my sister's engagement party, her fiancé spent the better part of an hour explaining to me why teachers don't understand real business. Then he started talking about the acquisition deal he was supposedly leading, and got the name of the company almost right. Almost. I recognized it immediately. It was mine. My name is Lainey, and I have spent the last 6 years being the daughter my family doesn't quite know what to do with. My mother, who volunteers on the school board and chairs 2 committees at her country club, introduces me to her friends with a smile that never fully reaches her eyes. "This is my older daughter," she says, then adds the part that always follows like a footnote. "She teaches elementary school. Isn't that sweet?" And then she pivots to my sister, Rue, who works in brand partnerships for a luxury hospitality company, and the tone of the entire conversation changes. I'm 30. I have a 4-bedroom craftsman house I bought on my own in Nashville. I drive a 7-year-old Subaru with a cracked cup holder and a Vanderbilt parking sticker I never removed. I dress the way people dress when they've stopped caring what their clothes signal, because they have more important things on their minds. My mother once handed me a gift card to Ann Taylor at Thanksgiving and suggested I invest in something with structure. I thanked her. I did not tell her I'd recently closed a contract worth more than her kitchen renovation. 3 years ago, I stopped teaching 4th grade. My family doesn't know that part. What they believe, that I still spend my days at Crestview Elementary, helping 8-year-olds with long division, attending parent-teacher conferences, going home smelling like dry erase markers. And yes, I did all of that, for 5 years, and I genuinely loved it. But somewhere around year 3, I started noticing something that drove me crazy. Every school in the district was drowning in data they couldn't use. Student progress reports that went into binders no one opened. Intervention alerts that arrived too late. Teachers doing the same paperwork 3 different ways, across 3 different systems that refused to talk to each other. So I started building something. At first it was just a spreadsheet tool I made for myself, something to track which students were falling behind and what interventions had been tried. Then a colleague asked to use it. Then a principal from another school. Then a district coordinator called and said she wanted to license it for her whole district, and I thought, okay, this might actually be something. ClearPath Learning launched properly 2.5 years ago. It's a learning management and student intervention platform, built specifically for K-12 districts. We track student data across systems, flag at-risk students before they fall through the cracks, and give teachers actual, actionable information, instead of more dashboards they don't have time to read. Last year, we served 41 school districts across 9 states. Our annual recurring revenue crossed 7 figures in the spring. I have 9 full-time employees, 2 of whom are former teachers. My co-founder, who handles the technical architecture, lives in Denver. We close contracts on government procurement timelines, which means a lot of waiting and a lot of paperwork, and I have become very good at both. My family has no idea any of this exists. Part of that is on me. In the early days, when I was still teaching full-time and building ClearPath on nights and weekends, I tried once, just once, to tell my mother what I was working on. We were on the phone. She asked how school was going. I said, actually, I've been developing a software platform on the side. It's starting to get some traction. There was a pause. Then she said, oh, that's a nice hobby. My friend's son did something with apps too. He ended up going back to finance. Then she asked if I'd seen that Rue had been featured in a travel magazine. That was the last time I brought it up. My boyfriend, Holt, knows. He's known almost from the beginning. He's the one who convinced me to actually incorporate, instead of just calling it a side project. And he's the one who sat with me in our kitchen at 11:30 at night, when we almost lost our first major contract, and talked me off the ledge. He's a structural engineer, which means he understands project timelines, budget overruns, and the specific misery of doing real technical work while someone with a nicer title takes the credit. We've been together 3 years. He's met my family enough times to understand exactly what I'm walking into every time we drive up to my parents' house in Franklin. Rue called me on a Thursday to tell me she was engaged. I was in the middle of reviewing a contract amendment, which is the sort of thing I'm doing now when she calls, though she doesn't know that. She was thrilled. She'd met Lance Carrington 14 months ago at some brand event in Miami, and she had been talking about him with a frequency that suggested something serious. He worked in finance. He'd gone to Duke. He had opinions about wine regions and a very strong handshake, according to Rue, who mentioned the handshake more than once. He's coming to the engagement party, she said. Mom's already planning it. You're coming, right? I said yes, I always say yes. The party was held at my parents' house on a Saturday in October, a catered affair with rented furniture on the back patio, string lights, and a cheese display that looked like it had been assembled by someone with a culinary degree. My mother had hired a bartender. She'd made custom cocktail napkins. My father wore a blazer I'd never seen before and greeted guests at the door with a warmth he usually kept in storage. When Holt and I arrived, Lance was already at the center of the living room. Tall, confident in the way that expensive suits and regular gym schedules make a certain kind of man confident. He had a drink in his hand and was mid-sentence with my father, and the two of them were already deep into a conversation about interest rates. My father was nodding with real enthusiasm, the kind he rarely showed anyone. Rue introduced us. Lance shook my hand with that handshake she'd described. He smiled, looked me over once in the way people do when they're calculating social value, and said it was great to meet me. Rue tells me you're a teacher, he said. I work in education, I said. He nodded, his expression landing somewhere between polite and patronizing. That's important work, really foundational stuff. The way he said foundational made it sound like a consolation prize. I said thank you. We moved to opposite sides of the room. For the first hour, I watched Lance perform. There is no other word for it. He was polished, quick with a joke, name-dropped a few people in a way that sounded casual but wasn't. He knew which wines to compliment. He asked my father about his years in commercial real estate, and when my father talked, Lance leaned in like everything being said was fascinating. My mother watched this and practically glowed. She had wanted someone like this for Rue. She had probably been wanting someone like this for years. At dinner, I was seated at the far end of the table. This is its own kind of message, the kind my mother sends without saying a word. Holt was beside me. Rue and Lance were at the head end, near my parents, where the important conversation was happening. Somewhere between the first and second course, Lance's attention drifted toward me. He asked about my classroom. I said I worked with a range of grade levels. He asked if I ever thought about going back to school myself, getting a master's degree in education leadership, moving up the ladder. I said I was pretty satisfied with where I was. He smiled the way people smile when they think you've settled for something small and have made peace with it. That's a great mindset, he said. Not everyone needs to be ambitious. Holt's hand found my knee under the table, a squeeze. Don't let it get to you. I understood what he meant. I also understood that there's a difference between diffusing tension and asking someone to stay small, and in that moment I couldn't tell which one he meant. Lance refilled his wine and settled back into his chair the way men do when they're about to say something they've been saving. So I've been following the edtech space pretty closely lately, he said, loud enough that the whole table could hear. It's one of the areas I've been advising in, real growth potential if you know where to look. My father leaned in. How's the investment climate right now? I've heard it's getting more selective. It is, Lance said. That's actually what makes this moment interesting. The weak players have shaken out. What's left are companies with actual staying power. He paused for effect. We're actually in the middle of a pretty significant acquisition right now. Mid-size edtech platform. K-12 focus. Good fundamentals. A little rough around the edges. But the underlying data infrastructure has real value. We're looking at restructuring the go-to-market and flipping it within 18 months. I set down my fork. He kept talking. The founder is one of those accidental entrepreneurs, stumbled into it from a teaching background, which, no offense to anyone here. He glanced briefly in my direction and smiled. Usually means the product intuition is good, but the business sophistication isn't there yet. That's where we come in. My mother said, that sounds fascinating. What's the company called? Lance thought for a moment. Clearbridge, I think. Something like that. It's in the Nashville market. Decent revenue for its size. I heard the name land wrong, just slightly off. Clearbridge instead of Clearpath, but close enough that something cold moved through my chest. I looked at Holt. He was already looking at me. His expression said, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" I was. Because I had been in active negotiations with Meridian Capital Partners for 4 months. I had sat in their offices in Charlotte. I had reviewed their term sheets. I had a folder on my laptop, 342 emails deep, containing every document, every roster, every organizational detail of their acquisition team. Lance Carrington's name was not in any of it. "What did you say the company was called?" I asked. My voice came out even, curious almost. He looked at me, a little surprised to be addressed directly. "Clearbridge, I think. Or Clear something. The branding's a little forgettable, honestly." "Clear Path Learning," I said. He pointed at me. "That's it, yeah. You've heard of it?" "I founded it," I said. The table went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that happens when someone drops a fork, the kind that happens when the air pressure in a room changes, and everyone feels it at once. Lance's smile held for 2 full seconds before something behind it shifted. "I'm sorry?" "Clear Path Learning," I said. "I'm the founder and CEO. I've been in acquisition discussions with Meridian Capital for the past 4 months." I opened my phone, unhurried, the way you open something you've had ready for a while. According to the team roster Meridian sent me in August, their acquisition group has 6 members. I have their names and titles right here. I turned the screen so the table could see the header, official Meridian Capital letterhead. Clear Path Learning, Acquisition Discussion, Team Directory. You're not listed. Lance's face did something complicated. The confidence was still trying to hold its shape but losing the battle. "I may be involved on an advisory basis," he said. "Some of these deals, the team structures aren't fully reflected in every document." "This is the complete roster," I said. "Sent to me 3 weeks ago by the managing director." I scrolled to the bottom of the document. "These are the only people I've had any communication with at Meridian. I've met all 6 of them in person, in Charlotte, over the course of 4 separate meetings." I looked up at him. "None of them have mentioned your name." My father put down his glass. "Lance," my mother said slowly, "just his name, nothing after it." Rue had not moved. She was staring at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger yet. Something that precedes anger. The moment when you're still deciding whether to believe what you're watching happen. "Babe," Lance started. "How do you know what company they're acquiring?" Rue said. Her voice was very quiet. "How do you know anything about this deal?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "You told me you were heading up a major acquisition," she said. "You showed me a presentation deck. You said you'd been in Charlotte for client meetings." She paused. "Were you actually in Charlotte?" He looked at the table. "Were you in Charlotte?" she said again. And now the quiet edge in her voice had sharpened into something else entirely. "I had not planned any of this. I want to be clear about that. I did not walk into my sister's engagement party with a strategy. I walked in carrying 4 months of deal documentation on my phone, because I carry it everywhere. Because that's what you do when something is in process and you might need to reference it at any moment. I pulled it out because a man I'd met 2 hours ago was lying about my company in front of my family, and I had the receipts sitting right there. But watching my sister's face in that moment, the way everything she'd believed about the past 14 months was rearranging itself in real time, I felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction, something more complicated, grief, maybe, for the version of that night that was supposed to exist. Lance left before dessert. He didn't make a scene about it. He stood, said something about needing to step outside and walked through the front door. We heard his car start, then he was gone. The silence he left behind had a texture to it. My father was the first to speak, and what he said surprised me. He didn't talk about Lance. He looked at me across the table and said, "You built a company." "Yes," I said. "And you never told us." I thought about the phone call years ago, when I'd tried. The pivot to Rue's magazine feature before I'd even finished my sentence. I thought about every holiday dinner where my mother had introduced me with that footnote. I thought about the 100 small ways a family can tell you, without ever saying the words, that they have already decided who you are, and they're not taking new information. "You never asked," I said. That landed differently than I expected. My mother's expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. My father looked down at his plate. Rue pressed her fingers to her mouth and turned toward the window, her shoulders shaking. Holt reached under the table and found my hand. He held it without saying anything, which was exactly right. The rest of that night was not a resolution. I want to be honest about that. My parents didn't suddenly understand me because of one dinner. My sister didn't process a broken engagement and a family revelation in the same evening and come out whole on the other side. We cleared the plates. My mother thanked the catering staff with her usual efficiency, as if the performance of competence was the only thing keeping her upright. My father poured himself a drink and sat in the living room without turning on the television. Before Holt and I left, my mother stopped me at the door. "I didn't know," she said, "about any of it." "I know," I said. "I should have asked." She said it carefully, like someone reading from a sentence she'd rewritten several times in her head. "I made assumptions about you for a long time, and I should have asked." It wasn't a full apology, but it was something true, which is more than I'd gotten from her in years. 3 weeks later, Rue called me on a Tuesday evening. She sounded different, quieter, like she'd put something down that she'd been carrying for a long time. She told me she'd ended things with Lance. She told me she'd started seeing a therapist. Then she told me something I've thought about almost every day since. "I spent so long trying to be the daughter who did everything right," she said. "And the whole time, you were the one actually building something real. I never even knew to look." We talked for 2 hours. About our parents, about the way we'd been sorted into our roles so early that we'd never thought to question them. About how the family we grew up in rewarded the appearance of success more than the substance of it, and what that had cost us both, in different ways. She asked if I'd be willing to talk to our mother, not to relitigate everything, just to start somewhere honest. I said yes. The acquisition closed in February. I won't share the specific number. That's between me and my attorney, but I negotiated a clause that kept me on as CEO through the transition and gave me board representation going forward. On the day the documents were signed, my co-founder sent me a bottle of good bourbon and a text that said, "You did it, from scratch. Nobody handed you a single thing." That part mattered more than the number. My mother called that same week. She'd heard from Rue that the deal had closed. We talked for 40 minutes, longer than we'd talked in years. She asked about ClearPath, how I'd started it, what it actually did, what the school districts used it for. Real questions, the kind that require actual listening. I answered all of them. At one point she got quiet and said, "I had no idea what you were building. I had no idea what you were capable of." I thought about saying something sharp. I had a few things ready. But what came out instead was just the truth. "I was always capable of it. You just weren't watching." She said, "I know." I think she meant it. My father texted me the following Sunday. Not called, texted, which for a 62-year-old man who still prints his emails is practically a grand gesture, and said he'd been reading about student data platforms and wanted to understand what problem ClearPath actually solved. Could he call sometime? I wrote back, yes, any Sunday. He called the next week. We talked for an hour. At the end, before we hung up, he said, "I'm proud of you, Lainey. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time after that, not crying, just sitting with it, letting something that had been waiting a long time finally settle. The thing about being invisible in a family is that you start to believe it's a fact about you rather than a choice they made. You stop wondering if they'd see you differently if they bothered to look, and start wondering if there's just nothing there to see. I spent years building ClearPath with that quiet in the background, that low constant hum of not being enough, and I think it made me work harder, but it also made me smaller than I needed to be. I'm done with small. Holt and I had a long conversation, in the weeks after the engagement party, about what it means to carry something alone. He understood why I'd kept the company separate from my family. He didn't fully understand why I'd kept it so compartmentalized from everything else. Why I sometimes came home from a board call that had gone well and said nothing, defaulted to fine, busy when he asked how the day was. He wasn't wrong to call that out. Some habits are armor you keep wearing after the war is over. We're working on it. The last Sunday dinner I went to at my parents' house was different from any I can remember. My mother made pot roast herself, from a recipe she'd found online and printed out, not from a catering order. The table wasn't set like a photo shoot. My father got my wine order right for the first time in my adult life. because he'd actually paid attention the time before. Nobody performed. That was the thing that struck me most. We just ate and talked and sat with each other in a way that felt almost ordinary. Almost like a family that had slowly, imperfectly, decided to try something different. I know it's not fixed. I know the patterns we spent decades building don't disappear over a few honest conversations. I know there will be dinners where something sideways gets said, and I'll have to decide whether to address it or let it go. I know this is work, the ongoing kind, not a problem that got solved in one evening. But I sat at that table and felt seen, for maybe the first time, in the house I grew up in. Not because I'd proven something. Not because a closing number had finally translated into language my family could understand. But because I had stopped disappearing, because I had taken up the space I was always allowed to take. I just hadn't known it yet. I built ClearPath in the margins of my life. At kitchen tables and in parking lots and on lunch breaks and in the early hours before the rest of the house was awake. I built it quietly because I had learned early that quiet was safer, that my ambitions took up less room when I kept them to myself. But the quiet was never the point. The quiet was just where I did the work. The work was always there, solid and accumulating, whether anyone was watching or not. And when the moment came, when someone tried to use it without knowing it was mine, I didn't waver, I didn't raise my voice, I just opened my phone and told the truth. That's all it ever took. The truth and the patience to wait until it mattered,